Welcome to this week's Q&A. We've got a fantastic question from a viewer in Sydney this week, and if it's not a question that you've asked, I think most people are asking themselves this one anyway. And the question was, look, what do you think about inflation? Do you think it is transitory, or do you think it's going to be permanent? And then clearly, this person was concerned about some of the outcomes that may produce in many ways in relation to building their personal wealth. Well, let's have a look at what's happened so far. So, we haven't had a taper tantrum, but we have had a big sell-off in bonds. We've had yields spike above 150 bips, both on 10-year Aussie bonds and Fed 10-year bonds. So that gives us an indication that markets are a little bit nervous in terms of where yields are going to go, and therefore where interest rates are going to go. But let's have a look at it in overall terms. Central banks around the world are really trying to keep a lid on interest rates. They're trying to support their various economies, they're trying to keep employment growing, and they're doing all the things that are necessary to counter the negative impacts from all the restrictions that we've had due to the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns that have been associated with that all around the world. So central banks are trying to stimulate economies, but now we're seeing a lot of supply chain shocks that are coming through and perhaps creating temporary inflation, as the Fed will have you believe, or many central banks believe, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that, but what I think it's worth actually thinking about is that we may be getting some inflation that is transitory, and some of that at the moment may be due to energy costs. But by the same token, we could have both. We could have an increased inflation in the shorter term, but also I think inflation that lasts for a longer period of time settles at a higher level than we've seen over the last virtually couple of decades now. So we've been in a very low inflation environment, and hence low bond yields, low interest rates. So we've just got to, be cognizant of the fact that this could change somewhat, and we need to prepare ourselves in case that happens. So what do you do? Well, in relation to, I suppose, looking at the assets that you have, make sure they are good quality assets, and that's regardless of whether that's property or equities or other assets. Try and make sure that you have great quality assets. If you own shares in companies, make sure these are companies that can sustain, I suppose, inflationary pressures. So it's always great to have companies that could pass on the effects of inflation through to their customers, so they've got pricing power. But obviously not all companies do have that. But it's important to look at that, and it's a little bit like looking at properties and saying, well, which properties are going to perform better because they're higher quality, and there aren't so many of them around, and they do have unique attributes, and they're in sought after regions. So the whole thing actually revolves about many of these concepts, which are basically common sense and relate to most assets. So people need to think that through. And the other area where you can still, I suppose, have some influence, if you have debts at the moment, if you have mortgages or investment loans, it's still eminently possible to fix some of those interest rates for, say, 5 years, somewhere around 3% for most people, perhaps 2% if it's your own home that you're living in Australia. So I think there are lots of things there, lots of drivers and levers that we can pull to make sure that if inflation is transitory and longer term, that you're well positioned to weather the outcome of that storm. I'm Andrew Unterweger from Wise Guru. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click like. See you again next week for our Q&A.